Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, multiculturalism isn't always everything that it's sold to you as. It isn't always high and mighty, noble and good. Too much multiculturalism is bad. There is such a thing as too much diversity, too many cultures, different cultures trying to coexist. And there are certain parts of those different cultures that are fundamentally irreconcilable. And so today I want to walk through all of the reasoning and logic and facts, as uncomfortable as they may be. We need to take the red pill, the uncomfortable, but nonetheless the truth, as opposed to the blue pill of everyone, no matter what they believe, can get along. That's simply naive. And it's actually a form of ideology that that doesn't necessarily align with what is true, but does help some people meet their needs. And I'll walk through that in the rest of this video. But first things first, grab your cup of tea, get nice and comfortable, get rid of distractions. We're going to dive in and lay out some foundational ideas before we come back to multiculturalism. So first things first, when it comes to cultures, we need to understand that cultures are fundamentally just a set of ideas. And those ideas are lived out in practice. So let's backpedal a little bit and establish what kind of ideas there are, right? We're going to go deep. We're going to leave no stone unturned, hopefully, in this video. So first thing, we can have ideas or beliefs with respect to what is true. And I've popped over here point A, because I'm going to draw a diagram in just a moment to make sense of this. We also have ideas with respect to what should be. So what is the ideal? What is the appropriate aim or the goal? And this is going to be a point B. And then we also have a notion based off what we've defined as point A and point B as to how we ought to bridge the gap between the two. And this is how we determine what is moral and good behavior versus what is immoral. So anything that moves us closer to point B is going to be considered moral. Anything that moves us away from point B is going to be considered immoral. So I'm going to draw our first diagram over here. We've got a point. I'm going to make this a little bit thicker. We have a point over here, which we'll just call point A. And this is current state. Another way of putting this is what is. And I'm going to use some of this terminology like point A and point B a little further down the line when we come back to thinking about cultures and assessing cultures and critiquing cultures. But for the moment, we need to have an understanding that point A is going to be present reality. What are the rules of the game here? Point B is going to be what we decide, or what a single person, what you or me decides as the desired state. So it's almost like current state. What is desired state? And this is kind of like what should be. And then based off what we believe is and ought to be, we're going to draw conclusions with respect to how we ought to act, how we ought to be in the world, what is good, what is appropriate behavior versus what is immoral behavior. So I think it's useful to just begin conceptualizing or categorizing ideas into one of these three categories, right? Ideas with respect to what is true. I don't know why that turned into a bit of a love heart, but what is true, right? In terms of the current state of affairs, what should be is like the second category of ideas. And then third category of ideas is, okay, given what is and what ought to be, given the current state of affairs, the rules of this game, and what we think the appropriate aim is, what is the appropriate behavior, or even things like policies or rituals or traditions that we ought to actually live out in practice. So I think this is a good starting point for establishing there are fundamentally three kind of categories of ideas. And then from there, we need to ask ourselves, can we find some common ground on some ideas are simply better than others? Okay, and this is where things get a little bit tricky, because then you can say, okay, well, by what benchmark can you measure or assess whether an idea is better or worse? And I'm going to read you a little something in a moment that hopefully helps us clarify the benchmark with which we will assess the goodness or badness or the betterness or worseness of an idea. So in order to do this, we need to establish or find some common ground with respect to the meta ideal, which is to say, we can have, you might have a particular specific goal in your life, and I might have a particular specific goal in my life. But from these two goals, right, your goal, my goal, can we establish a higher order goal, right? Or a what I'm referring to here on the whiteboard as a meta ideal or a meta goal. It's like the goal of goals. And if you take everyone in a team, right, they might have individual goals that they're working towards within the team, but then the team as a whole has a meta goal or a meta ideal to which it strives. The same type of thinking can be applied to individuals within a collective of some sort. So we are all, members of the human species, right? The Homo sapiens species, and we each have our individual goals. But we maybe, between the squillions of little goals that we have, is there some kind of unifying meta ideal that we could put our finger on and use as a basis from which to then assess the quality of ideas? Is this a good idea or is this a bad idea? And some of you might think, of course there are good ideas. Of course there are some ideas that are simply better than others, and I would agree with you, but what I'm doing is getting to the root of the logic here so that essentially if anyone tries to go against it, we know how deep we need to go down with respect to one's reasoning and one's assumptions in order to find common ground. So we need to find common ground on, is there a meta ideal or a goal of goals with respect that we can find common ground on? And I think a good place to begin is finding common ground on what is evil and then using that as a basis to establish a shared meta ideal or meta goal. So what I mean by that is, let's say we've got point A, point B, and we've got some idea of roughly how we're going to go between the two. Now, it's kind of hard to say, okay, exactly what should point B be? You're going to have an idea, I'm going to have an idea, but can we find common ground? And if you've seen the video that I've recorded on, I think I titled it something like why you might believe in God but just not know it yet. Right, let's say there's an alternate point B down here where we've got the amplification and enjoyment in unnecessary suffering. So a little thought experiment, right? Let's say that you have, this actually isn't all that much of a thought experiment. I think it was Milgram's experiment where there was essentially people in this experiment and other participants of the experiment were asked to turn up like an electrocution knob. Just imagine in this case that we had a situation where there was essentially a torture knob, right? Where you could turn up the pain and suffering of an individual, or worse, multiple individuals, right? A group of people. Now, can we find common ground that enjoying inflicting unnecessary suffering on a conscious, sentient being is evil? Can we find common ground that is evil? And if we can find common ground that this is evil, right? Or maybe I should, I suppose we're finding common ground that this is not a good thing, then we can find common ground that something in the opposite direction is good. Okay? Now, exactly what that is very difficult to define. And this is where I find it useful, the analogy that Sam Harris gives is the moral landscape, the title of one of his books, which is to say there are multiple peaks of maximizing well-being is the expression that he uses to denote the meta goal. He denotes the meta goal, the meta ideal, the goal of goals, the goal that kind of unifies your goal, my goal, and everyone else's goal, at least in the modern West, is there might be a number of ways or a number of instantiations of that meta ideal, a number of different ways as well to get to the highest peak. But that also means there are a number of ways to get us to metaphorical hell as well, which might be, if enough people become possessed by this spirit or let themselves become possessed by this spirit, how we end up going that way. So let's just find common ground for the moment. If we can find common ground that the amplification and enjoyment in inflicting unnecessary suffering and pain in other conscious, sentient creatures, beings, is bad, right? If we can find common ground on that, then that's a good start, right? That's the benchmark by which we could then start assessing, okay, what is a good idea? What is a bad idea? A bad idea is going to take us closer to metaphorical hell, and a good idea is going to take us closer to metaphorical heaven. Now, if you have issues with those words, right? Like I know that the younger me would have had issues with those words. You can just call it, the meta ideal. The meta ideal, which is generally speaking, how about everyone is happier, healthier, and wealthier, right? Like that's a good thing. Everyone's overcoming the tragedies in their experience and their life. Whereas the opposite of the meta ideal, the meta point B from which we ought to try and avoid is everyone suffering more, right? Can we find common ground that everyone suffering more is not what we ought to be aiming for? That's all we need to find common ground on. And so if we can find common ground on evil, what down looks like, then it implies, okay, we have a rough conception of what up looks like. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to pull up a passage to just really hammer this idea home and clarify it before we move further forward. Alrighty, I'm going to try and lay down some first principles here. So, on the uniquely human religious question, our need for purpose and meaning, and the role of belief systems in meeting that need. Either A, we observe what is and allow ourselves to be informed, or we, B, oversimplify and choose what is convenient. Now, you might be thinking, how does all this have anything to do with multiculturalism? I'm going deep here so that you understand, we really get to the bottom of things. So, let me mark this up and we're going to go through and I'm going to provide some commentary. We are animals and each have an inescapable and unavoidable nature as Homo sapien. We require water, we require food, we require sleep, but we also require touch and social connection. And we are the only species that requires meaning and direction, born of the discomfort that comes with self-consciousness. Animals which are not self-conscious, they don't stop to ask, what am I doing here? What's my purpose? How do I find something worth living for to offset an expression that you'll hear me use time and time again, the suffering and tragedy that is baked into the game of being. We need something to offset, to counterbalance that. For us, the lights are on. We're aware of ourselves, of being and becoming, of what has been, what is, and what will be, as well as our progression through each and our divine-like power to make choices beyond mere unconscious drives and instincts. And in doing so, influence the creation of and unfolding of reality. We have not just eaten of the tree of life, but also the tree of knowledge. We are awake to our capacity for choice and sacrifice, and with it, morality, good and evil. We know what it is to sin. Our bodies tell us. We are like God in that we are the universe, awake and aware of itself in both us, me, and you, and the other. And we see each other, we see each of our respective capacities as moral agents instead of mere instinct-driven automatons. Again, the lights are on, and the premise, the bedrock of human rights, is that we also see the lights are on in others. In them too, there is this Holy Spirit, you might say. All of this is to say the burden of the lights being on, of self-consciousness, brings with it Homo sapiens' psychophysiological need for meaning, direction, and purpose. We suffer awake, eyes wide open, painfully so sometimes. We know intimately the tragedy of being, of life, and we have the very real option of ending it all under the weight of such tragedy. The choice of suicide forever beckons. So what is it that staves off this perfectly reasonable pull toward nothingness, toward ending the game, perhaps not only for ourselves, but for others too? What is it that keeps us on the straight and narrow path of being, of continuing the game, of propagating the game onto another, perhaps our children? A proclamation that it's all worth it. A proclamation that despite all the limitations, suffering, and tragedy, being is still good and worthwhile. The fundamental act of faith. So then, what is it that makes being worthwhile? Why should we continue to say a yes to life and to being despite all its self-evident and painful limitations? This is the human question. This is the religious question. That's why humans have religion, animals do not. To ask such questions is to be in the religious or perhaps the spiritual realm. The question of why. Why am I here? Why should I stick around? What is all this for? We, Homo sapien, whether we realize it or not, whether we mouth the words or not, are by nature religious, if we define religious in the way that I have just before. There is forever at base this question of why. This is man's search for meaning, to use Frankl's wording. We need meaning and a sense of purpose to stave off the defaulting into nihilism and the unavoidable reality of what can become an unbearable tragedy, suffering, and limitation, again, baked into this game of being. This meaning and purpose, that which gives us our foundational sense of direction and orientation, is a human need. It's not a desire, it's not a want, but a need. And unmet, we end. The suffering becomes too much. Our heart posture changes from, yes, life is good, to no, it is unworthy of existence, of continuation. The game ought to come to an end and the lights turned off. Homo sapien, the lights on, self-aware, will-endowed moral agent, is religious and has a psychophysiological, psychobiological need for meaning, purpose, and direction toward an ideal that justifies being. And so the religions of the world have been Homo sapiens' attempts at articulating painstakingly through drama and story our why, attempting to make known and pull into the light of our collective reason, and the light of our collective consciousness, our raison d'être. Given what is all this limitation, the suffering and tragedy, what should we be doing? Without these formalized religions and their religious stories, perhaps, the deepest stories that we have, without these we lack the deep sense of meaning, purpose, and direction we need. This unavoidable, intractable, and immutable human need for meaning, purpose, and direction is unmet. Bear with me here. I'm going to tie this all back within the realm of why multiculturalism can be bad. Why too much multiculturalism can be bad. And so other stories, ideologies, a couple of the modern ones I will point to in a moment, fill the void and take their place. Ideologies like multiculturalism to no end. If these religious stories on which we've relied for our sense of meaning, purpose, and direction, and self-esteem as well, we do not simply not believe, rather, the stories are replaced and we begin believing in something else. The vacuum is filled and the psychophysiological, psychobiological need fulfilled by ideology. In this case, and I'm going to be tying it back to the ideology of multiculturalism to no end, what I'll refer to as the infinite yes, a little further down the line. If religion refers to a complete story with all the archetypal characters of being, positive and negative order or structure or the known, the positive and element aspects of chaos or creativity, novelty of the unknown, and also positive and negative individual or locus of consciousness or agent, then ideology is an incomplete story, oversimplified and inaccurate. Now, if some of that doesn't land with you, bear with me, do not sweat. Without religion and its stories, in religion's void, our uniquely human need for meaning can be, and many would argue is currently being met conveniently by ideology. Our intellect has sawn off the branch on which we sit, divorced from the dream and its embodied knowledge on which we and our civilizations stand. All this to say that our beliefs, our maps of interpretation and action, our maps of meaning, they can be informed by humility and by observation, or they can be created and proclaimed from a place of pride, hubris, and perhaps desperation and convenience. It is for this reason that pride comes before the fall. Our maps of interpretation and action, unhumbled by reality, ossify and become rigid and outdated, unadapted and unattuned to the entropic and ever-changing environment. And thus we fall. We don't necessarily believe or form our beliefs via careful observation, allowing ourselves to be informed, put in form, and ordered by the incoming data, by information. Rather, we believe or choose our beliefs via convenient but arrogant and expedient proclamation. We choose the blue pill. Why? Not because it's true, but because it's comfortable. Because it meets our needs, this spiritual need. We need complete and accurate stories, or at least that answer. My apologies. We need complete and accurate stories that answer, or at least try to answer, the religious or spiritual question and meet Homo sapiens' intractable need for meaning, purpose, and direction in the face of life's suffering, vis-a-vis the tragedy of limited being. And just for a moment here, this notion of complete and accurate stories, you may hear some people like Jordan Peterson describe this framework of what is, let me get my highlighter, of what is, what ought to be, and the transition or the pathway between the two. This is a narrative structure or a story structure. And so you may hear some people make the argument that we experience the world. We as Homo sapiens, we see the world through a narrative framework, which is to say we have our eyes wide awake to potential. Born of our imagination and our conception of time, we have an idea of, okay, there is a current state. Oh, okay, we can imagine a future desired state, and we can make sacrifices and behave in a way that gets us there. Coming back here. Without these stories, without complete and accurate stories, we buckle under the burden of having the lights on and being awake. We buckle, we self-destruct, and we choose to end the game, or we desperately latch onto an incomplete story, an ideology, or as Jordan Peterson would put it, a crippled religion. A religion being a sophisticated, accurate, and complete story with all of the core elements or the archetypes of being. And a crippled religion being an incomplete version of that. An incomplete but convenient story that meets some of our needs as Homo sapiens. Lights on in the face of the burden of self-consciousness. We need good, true, accurate, and complete stories if we are to succeed, onwards and upwards. The alternative leads to oblivion, or worse, hell. The archetypal hero, the main character of our religious stories, in the face of eyes wide open to life's tragedy and suffering, commits himself not to convenient and comfortable blue pill truths, but rather to confrontation with the brutal reality of life, of limitation, of suffering, of tragedy, but a nonetheless courageous and committed standing tall in the face of everything. An amor fati, yes. A proclamation by his very being and doing in the world that this is good. A commitment to the game of life, the game of overcoming and transcendence toward the good via self-sacrifice. Okay. Maybe what we can say, the meta-ideal is the opposite of whatever the amplification and enjoyment of amplification of evil is. Right? So if evil in the face of reality is turning up the torture knob and enjoying it, and maybe also it doesn't even have to be evil, it can be ignorance or a choosing of untruth that takes us closer there. Up here, you can find common ground that the meta-ideal is either use the language that helps you find common ground with whoever you're speaking with, overcoming unnecessary suffering for conscious beings, or maximizing well-being of sentient beings, might be how someone like Sam Harris would put it. Okay. Can we find common ground that the goal is overcoming suffering or progress, some notion of meta-progress, or some kind of transcending of the tragedies of evil, of limitation, right? Can we agree that overcoming poverty is a good thing? Can we agree that overcoming cancer is a good thing? Now, I'll mention here, this already has a religious or spiritual grounding, yeah? In the notion, and I think it's a Judeo-Christian notion, it may come from other religions as well, but the notion that every individual has an element of the divine. There is a divine spark in each and every member of the human species, of Homo sapien. And this sacred divine spark is the bedrock from which the notion of human rights comes. It's not just might equals right. It's not just that I can use anyone instrumentally for my own selfish purposes. No, there's some kind of deep, deep belief that each and every person has an element of the divine or the sacred in them. And that's we don't even realize that's the bedrock of the notion of human rights and also liberal democracies in the West. But we don't even realize that it's anchored in this religious or spiritual idea, the idea that there is a divine spark or element in each and every individual. Okay. So, all of that said, hopefully you can then find common ground with whoever you're speaking with, that there are some ideas that are better than other ideas, and some criteria by which we can assess whether one idea is better than another is, does idea one help us move up toward, that version of point B where we overcome unnecessary suffering, we overcome cancer, we overcome poverty, we overcome whatever form of suffering we can put our finger on, of unnecessary suffering. We can overcome it. We can, in some way, shape or form, progress or transcend our present limitations. And as compared to idea number 2, which is either untrue, out of alignment with reality, with an objective reality. So if you have a map or a conception of what is that is out of alignment with the underlying reality, the objective reality, then you're going to be making decisions as to how to be that will not bring about the point B that you had planned. Yeah, so this is where I think you can make a strong argument that an idea that is true is better than an idea that is untrue, okay? And then we can elaborate on that. So ideas that are false or inaccurate or mistaken, these ideas are worse than these ideas over here that are true and that help us align our map of what is with what actually is, so that we can better predict the outcomes of our actions and overcome the suffering and progress upwards toward metaphorical heaven. We can also say that bad ideas, right? These ideas, idea 2, it moves us down, right? Down toward that metaphorical hell. Now, brief note here with respect to PM, postmodernism, all interpretations are equal. There is no such thing as an objective truth. Now, if you're familiar with postmodernism, you'll hear this claim made that all truth claims are essentially bids for power. There's no such thing as an objective truth. And I wanted to briefly just mention, if ever someone mentions this to me, I just think, well, okay, show me. You can mouth those words, sure, but you don't act like all truth claims are equally valid, because some truth claims will get you killed, right? If you try to, it's like prove the subjectivity, prove that gravity is just an arbitrary subjective truth, right? Jump off the 50th story balcony and let's see whether you actually believe that all interpretations are equally valid and that there is no such thing as an objective truth. So you can say those words, but no one really acts like it's true. And if they do, reality comes back to smack them in the face. So all of that is groundwork for some ideas we can say are better than others based on our shared understanding or our common ground of what is the meta ideal, some form of progress, overcoming the suffering that is baked into being, and moving away from that point B at the bottom of my diagram over here, that is somehow amplifying and potentially even enjoying the amplification of suffering. So there is a way to say some ideas are good and some ideas are bad. All you need to do to be able to establish that benchmark with someone that you're trying to find common ground with, ideally, all you need to do to establish that benchmark is find common ground that there is such a thing as evil. And then if someone's pushing back on that, give a specific example. Like, can we agree that the Auschwitz guard who enjoys inflicting suffering on the Jews in the concentration camp, can we agree that that is evil? If you can't find common ground with that, you're in some strife, I suppose. You're in a pickle. So we are assessing the quality of these ideas based off of this somewhat Judeo-Christian belief that there is a divine element. Every single human being there is a divine element in them that means they are of value, and that we ought to try and alleviate, overcome, transcend the suffering born of limitation that is the game of human being. Okay, now, how do we separate the wheat from the chaff? How do we separate the good from the bad? Critiquing ideas does not make you a bad person. Vetting ideas does not make you a bad person, right? So obviously, if you're having a conversation with someone and you say, okay, we're unattached to these ideas, we're going to vet them. If we have this idea with respect to what is, can we vet it? And, coming back to that description of point A, point B, if we have an idea of what is, and you have an idea of what is, can we vet them and say, okay, which one of these is accurate, which one of these is inaccurate? Yes, we can. Can we have a conception as to, okay, I think the ideal goal is here, you think the ideal goal is this thing over here? Can we vet them? Can we critique, okay, well, actually, I think your idea is great and I've missed something here, or vice versa. And then once we find common ground on what is and what the meta ideal is, or what a specific ideal is, okay, what's the game plan for getting between the two? Can we unpack it together and critique one another's conception of what is, what ought to be, and how we make our way there? Yes, we can. And critiquing ideas does not make you a bad person, obviously. Okay. Now, this is also just a brief, I might do a future episode on this that goes deeper, but you have your experience. I have my experience. You represent your experience with language. I represent my experience with language. So I'll go experience, and then we're going to share our notes, right? And essentially this sharing of notes is communication. It can be spoken, it can be written, but we are comparing notes with respect to our worldviews, which is, by the way, these three categories of ideas of what is, point A, what ought to be, point B, and how to progress between the two, what should be done to bridge the gap. These are essentially our worldviews, okay? And so we, based on our experiences and everything that we experience and learn, we then abstract that. We create simulations in our mind of what is, or representations or abstractions of what is and what ought to be, and then we share those via communication, which is why I'll make a brief note here that placing limitations on communication or limitations on language, say, for example, under the banner of hate speech or some kind of limitations on speech so as to protect the weak and vulnerable, that comes at the cost of potentially also limiting our capacity to compare notes with respect to worldviews, what is, what ought to be, and how we bridge the gap. It is to kerfuffle us. It is to place a limitation on language that limits collective problem solving and can also be used as a control tool. Okay. So we've covered ideas, three categories roughly of ideas that make up each of our worldviews. What is, what should be, and how to bridge the gap, or what type of actions, what mode of being ought we embody to bridge the gap from point A to the ideal point B, which is the benchmark that we then use to establish which ideas are good and which ideas are not so good, which ideas are better than others, which ideas take us closer to the meta ideal as compared to ideas that do not. Okay, let's tie this to culture. Culture is just a set of ideas, usually collectively held. Okay, now you can have a culture with yourself. You can have a personal brand or a personal culture. You can have a culture in your family. You establish the culture in your family or in your social group. And then you can abstract it, yeah? So, we can think, okay, there's you and say your partner. And you're going to have a set of ideas that you live out, that you abide by, that you align on, that you agree, a set or a shared conception of point A, point B, and the way to bridge the gap between the two. And you can not only have a culture between two people, but then 3 and 4, etc., 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 until you end up with, say, a nation or a species even. Okay. So a culture is just a set of ideas with respect to what is the goal, point A, point B, and how to be or what to do to bridge the gap between. And this is often institutionalized in rites, rituals, and traditions. The exact same principles apply to what I said before. We can have better or worse ideas, which means we can have better or worse sets of ideas that take us closer to point A, point B, the meta ideal, up, progress, heaven, transcending, overcoming the suffering for as many sentient beings as possible, versus we can have ideas that take us closer to metaphorical hell and turn up that torture knob. And if we can find common ground on there are better and worse ideas, there are better or worse sets of ideas, then we have to take that to its logical extreme, which is that there are better or worse cultures. Now, how to figure out which is which? What are the good cultures? What are the bad cultures? Or how do we figure out which cultures are better than others? And that doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to be a holistic judgment of this culture is wholly better than that culture. But you can critique different cultures. You can say this culture over here, it does really well with, in this specific area or element, versus this culture clearly has a strength or is really good at ABC, whatnot. And you can critique. We need to critique. We need to go, hey, what are those guys over there on that team doing well? Maybe we can learn something from them. And what are those guys over there doing something, what are they doing that's working well? Can we learn from them? And then can we amalgamate the best of both worlds, so to speak? So we need to critique different cultures. We need to engage in dialogue. And that does not make you a bad person. It does not make you a bigot. It does not make you a racist. It can mean that you're committed to figuring out what is the highest ideal, the meta ideal, for which we can aim and unify our efforts toward. Jordan Peterson, in a video I watched recently, defined God as the proper unity, which I thought was very interesting. Critiquing different cultures. What are they doing well? What are they not doing so well? Does not make you a bad person, a bigot, or a racist. If it is coming from the place of what is good, right? What is true, point A. What is good, the ideal to which we ought to strive, the ultimate point B. And then based off that, how is it that one should be in the world? What actions should we take? And based, on the level of the individual as well as, expanding out into the level of the group or the community or the society. Okay. So we've established we can ascertain via dialogue whether we have a good idea or a bad idea. If we can do that, we can apply the same to sets of ideas, and all a culture is a set of ideas lived out, usually collectively held. And therefore, we need to critique cultures. We need to be able to engage in dialogue and say, hey, that set of ideas over there, I'm going to pinpoint a particular idea within that group, not a good one. And here's why. Let me explain to you via reason why it's not a good idea, why it takes us closer to the metaphorical hell, and why this idea over here is better than that one because it takes us closer to the metaphorical heaven. Okay, multicultural. What does it mean? We get slammed with this word so much that it almost loses its meaning. We're pro-multiculturalism. Multiculturalism is good. Now, I'll quickly say what I can find common ground on. Multiculturalism, I think a lot of people use multiculturalism to actually mean a value for liberalism, which is to say, let's maximize people's individual autonomy and freedom. And this is the like, you do you. But we have to be careful not to let that go off the rails. It's not you do you to infinity and beyond. There are still some boundaries, right? And one of the boundaries is still maintaining or protecting the value for liberalism. And I'll get to this a little bit later, the paradox of tolerance. So what does it mean to be multicultural? It means multiple cultures. We can kind of break this down, yeah? Multicultural, multiple cultures, or multiple sets of ideas, keyword here, coexisting. Yeah. Now, is it good? Is there a degree of diversity that is beneficial? And when does it become too much? And I think the key word here is coexisting. And also, I'm just going to rewind and just highlight this Judeo-Christian value for human rights anchored in this belief that there is an element of the sacred or the divine in each and every human being. Okay, so multiculturalism, I think a lot of people use it to mean maximizing freedom and autonomy. I can find common ground with that. But when does multiculturalism go too far? When does too much multiculturalism become too much? Okay, we need to establish our sense of identity and what our standards are before we can decide what we include and what we don't include. What cultures or sets of ideas make it onto the team? What cultures or sets of ideas will we say that is good? And therefore, come on in, join the club, or join the community, join the team. So, let me make this a little bit smaller. What are the core ideas or values, for example, in the West, that we as a team are not willing to compromise on? What are the non-negotiables? And then and only then, after having defined our culture, what is it that we stand for exactly? Then and only then are we able to ask the question and answer the question, what are the ideas, values, or cultures that are incompatible with us and our team and our worldview of what is, what ought to be, and how we're going to get between the two? Cultures whose diversity we actually do not want because they deviate from or contradict central parts of our own. Now, all of this to say, if we don't have a sense of who we are, if we lack a sense of identity and the standards that go along with it, then we lack the capacity, right? If we lack these, we lack identity, we lack the standards that go along with it, we actually don't know how to say no. And all we can say is yes. And you're going to hear me use this expression probably in future videos as well, the infinite yes. We are possessed. This is the new God of the faithless West, is the infinite yes. It's inclusion and equality to no end. Inclusion and equality to no end. These are the new gods. These are the modern gods. The false idols and modern gods. Okay. So, what to do when we have fundamental differences in our ideas? What to do when we have fundamental differences between culture A and culture B? We need to get back to some first principles. In the face of a central conflict, right? And I'm going to define, briefly just mention what central means here, right? You can say each to their own. If you're in a relationship with someone, you can disagree with respect to the best flavor of jam, okay? That's not a central conflict. Let's define that as a peripheral conflict. There are certain things with your partner, when you're starting a family, you have to find common ground on with them, right? There are certain elements of your maps that must be aligned in order for you to coexist as a team, right? And again, you can come back to thinking about this as those three categories of ideas. Point A, point B, and how to get between the two. That is a central conflict. If you have fundamentally irreconcilable ideas with respect to point A and point B and how to get between them, you're not going to be able to coexist as a unified team. Now let's start with one-on-one. So I think, and I want to start with one-on-one because we oftentimes, conflict resolution can seem, I mean, this might sound, I might contradict myself a little bit here, but conflict resolution on the one-to-one level can seem rather straightforward when we really break it down, okay? But then for some reason, when we scale to the macro and we think of conflict between countries and teams, all of a sudden we let go of our intuitions and our embodied knowledge and wisdom, and it's like our intellect runs loose and chops the branch on which we sit. Okay, so here we go. In the face of a central conflict, say, for example, with your partner, okay? You're going to be starting a family, you run into a conflict. You have three options that I've highlighted here. You have unity via dialogue and common ground, and I would say that is the ideal form of conflict resolution. You use discussion and conversation to understand one another, to vet one another's ideas, and to then align your maps, okay? Now, another form of so-called unity is via force. Now, I'm going to write, the extreme instantiations of this are slavery and war, where you have a conflict with someone and you forcibly make them act out your worldview of what is point A, what should be point B, and how to get between the two. You don't engage in dialogue to go, okay, well, this is my conception of A, B, and how to get between. That's your conception. Can I point out something that you might have missed and you point out something that I might have missed, and we align our maps via dialogue to find unity, a shared worldview, the proper unity, which JP might have described, that we then use to operate as a team together. If you can't do that, then you can resolve conflict or find unity or establish unity via force, and the extreme instantiations are slavery and war. Or you divide. You go your separate ways. You cannot coexist, and so you separate, right? And that's actually, that's divorce. That's divorce on the one-to-one level, and it's the separation of, say, a unified nation into two different countries. It's like we have fundamentally irreconcilable beliefs with respect to point A, point B, and how to get between. And so we need to say, you're going to have your own team, we're going to have our own team. Now, once we've established all, and I've just written, kind of drawn some pictures here, yeah? So this is engaging via dialogue to establish unity. This is tyranny or authoritarianism, establishing a unity via force, and I've just kind of drawn something that represents slavery. And then option 3 is we go our separate ways. We are not on the same team anymore because our worldviews, our maps of point A, point B, and how to get between are fundamentally irreconcilable. Okay, now, a principle. The macro mirrors the minor. If we apply what I've just walked through to conflict, let me get my blue pen over here, applied to conflict and resolution methods, those 3 resolution methods, we can notice that these 3 resolution methods, they scale to groups. They scale to cultures. If we have 2 sets of people with 2 different sets of ideas, how do we coexist? We either 1, engage in dialogue and align our maps. 2, we force one culture or one group of people to live out the map of the other. We subjugate. Or we do not coexist. We go our separate ways. Now, an error, like I mentioned before, is we tend to just lose our ability for reason at the macro scale. It seems so obvious on the individual scale that this is how you have to resolve conflict. And obviously the ideal is this option 1, 99% of the time. At least no one who's watching this should be for slavery or for unnecessary war if it can be avoided via dialogue and aligning our maps with respect to what is, what ought to be, and how to bridge the gap. Now, this applies to pathology and personality. This principle of the macro mirrors the micro, which is to say, the group level is born of the individual. The country, the nation, the culture is born of individuals. And macropathology is born of macropathology is born of micropathology, which is to say the group level pathology or illness or sickness is born of ill individuals. You and me are the culture. We can forget sometimes that we are, the culture is just the average of the ideas lived out and held by the individuals. We each are a component of the culture. We contribute to living out or updating the culture. Okay. And I've just written here, welcome to adulthood. To be an adult is to recognize and fully embrace the responsibility for the culture. All right, I'm going to turn the aircon on once. All right, I'm back. Now, you might be thinking, why am I mentioning this macro pathology? And I'm going to walk you through why this obsession with equality, this obsession with multiculturalism, to no end, the infinite yes that we seem to be living out on the group level, this infinite yes is born of micropathology. It's born of pathology and illness, or a spiritual sickness on the level of the individual that's manifesting on the level of the group, the community, and the culture. So, if we have, let's tie this all together to multiculturalism. We can have too much multiculturalism, in the sense that there are certain sets of ideas or certain ideas that we, in order to be on the same team, working together in the same direction, there are some elements of our worldview that must be aligned. And again, just think of you and your partner in raising a family. There are some things you cannot afford. You just you can't disagree upon them. You need to find common ground on certain core elements of what is, what should be, and how are we going to get there together as a team. The exact same thing applies on the group level with sets of ideas or cultures. You can have too much diversity. And if you do, you get division or you get war. And I popped here these numbers, 2 and 3. It's coming back to these diagrams, right? Too much multiculturalism is this: war, one group of people and their culture subjugating the other, or too much multiculturalism and central conflicts between those cultures, leading to division. The proper unity is dialogue. Dialogue refining our respective maps of what is, what ought to be, and how we can bridge the gap together. Common ground. Now, our maps of what is, what should be, and how to get there are too far out of alignment, and that's what leads to either the division or the war, conflict resolution methods 2 and 3. I wanted to add a note here with respect to the paradox of tolerance. If we are tolerant of anything and everything, which is to say, it's like extreme tolerance. Extreme tolerance. Extreme tolerance is to be a pushover. Again, everyone knows on the individual level, right? pushover. To be a pushover is to have no standards. It's to not know your own worth. It's to have zero conception of what is, what should be, and how to bridge the gap. It's to just be a blob of lack of direction. It's to be a feather in the wind. Extreme tolerance, in the same way on the level of the individual scaled up to the level of the group, leaves you vulnerable to intolerance or anti-liberalism. And so what you can see here is just a little diagram that depicts extreme liberalism that says you do you, all cultures are welcome, all ideas are equally valid. It's like postmodernism, all truth claims are equally valid, all claims, all grand narratives are equally valid, all stories, conceptions of what is, what ought to be, and how to bridge the gap, all equally valid. Equality, 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 false idol, the modern God. That leaves you susceptible to the cultures, groups of people, sets of individuals who are anti-liberal, ready to take advantage of your naive and desperate extreme liberalism, to the point where their intolerance usurps your extreme tolerance. And then they're intolerant of you and your liberalism. Now, this is again, we know this on the level of the individual. The person who is tolerant of anything and everything, inclusive of everyone, is a pushover and has no sense of identity or self-worth, no ability to establish boundaries, right? It is to not have a front door and a lock on your house, right? Everyone knows on the level of the individual and of the family, as an example, you have a house with a lock on it, right? You don't let anyone and everyone into your house. You have certain standards and boundaries. You are not an extreme liberal. You are not extremely tolerant to no end. But for some reason, on the level of the group, we lose this faculty to just think through things clearly. And what I want to point out is that we have this paradox of tolerance where if we are too tolerant, we become so tolerant that we allow in those who are intolerant of us. And it's almost like if you don't know what story you are living out or what your value hierarchy is, you don't have a sophisticated conception of what is and what ought to be and how we ought to get there. You can't argue in the best way possible for your worldview and your conception of morality in a way that helps you tease out, are you correct? Are you wrong? Are you missing someone? And what about them? Are they missing something? Can we collectively come together and move up? If you don't know that, you are a leaf in the wind and you are susceptible to those who are ready to use you as an instrument in their story, right? You will live out someone else's story. You will live out someone else's hierarchy. And maybe when you finally have maybe the courage or the maturity to establish your worldview and what you believe is where you should be going, what ought to be, maybe at that point it's too late because the intolerance that you have allowed in has already usurped your liberalism and your freedoms, okay? Now we have in the modern West this pathological obsession with inclusion and compassion, born of a lack of identity. We don't know who we are. We don't know what we stand for anymore. We don't know what our values are. And so the new God is equality to no end, which means everything is equal. Include, include, include. To say one thing is better than another is to be a bigot or a racist. We are desperate. This is the ideology of which I was talking about before when I was back here. right? This unavoidable, intractable, and immutable human need is unmet if we don't have a conception, a sophisticated story or conception of point A, point B, and how to bridge the gap. And so other stories, ideologies, equality to no end, multiculturalism to no end is the ultimate ideal to critique or to judge any idea under the banner of someone's culture is to be a bigot or a racist. These ideologies fill the void and take their place, not because we necessarily believe that they are true, but because they are needed by those who are desperate for a sense of meaning and purpose in the world. And so we become by this possessed by this spirit of the infinite yes. Yes, yes, yes. This, another way of putting this is the infinite yes is no boundaries. No boundaries. There is no such thing, no borders, right? We see this. We see this in Europe. And a great book for exploring this on the level of countries and the collective is The Strange Death of Europe by Douglas Murray, and also the documentary Borderless by Lauren Sutherland. It is to have no boundaries, no borders. It is to fundamentally stigmatize no. It is to say yes to infinity and beyond. Yes and inclusion and equality. These are the new gods of the modern era. And they manifest in this pathological multiculturalism that says any and all cultures are equal and valid, and to critique ideas, right? To critique, to compare one to the other and say, hey, you know what? Maybe that culture is better at ABC, and maybe that other culture might be better at DEF. This is to be a racist or a bigot. And if you've watched one of my other recent videos on God, it comes from the victim-savior dynamic. People are so, again, this infinite yes, if you are to argue for maybe there ought to be some boundaries, maybe there ought to be a no, maybe there ought to be some kind of discernment between what ideas we are actually for and what ideas we are not for, you are jeopardizing oftentimes someone's, by questioning someone on their worldview, you are potentially undermining their sacred source of meaning. Now, I've added a note here as well with respect to masculinity and femininity. I'm not going to go too deep on this, but this term toxic masculinity has permeated our culture over the last decade or two, and I think I can find some common ground with a lot of people on this. Maybe we want to say that this is the excesses of masculinity. It's almost like unhinged masculinity, right? And if what are the male-like characteristics? Male typical qualities. Maybe you want to say something like aggression or a tendency towards physical aggression. And that gone too far, that unhinged, that excess aggression, perhaps premature opting for physical aggression to resolve conflict might be termed an excessive masculinity or toxic masculinity. If we can find common ground on that, then what is toxic femininity? What is the feminine instinct taken too far? What is the feminine instinct? What is female typical? Perhaps a caretaking or compassionate instinct. And on the level of the individual, this taken too far is the devouring mother. It is the mother who devours devours the child's potential in order to remain the forever mother. She creates the forever child by coddling and babying. She affirms any and all claims of I'm the victim. The world is against you. You are perfect as you are, my little butterfly. Why? It's a tough question. Why do we have this, what we might label as the excesses of this caretaking and compassionate instinct? Why do we have this gone to its extremes, by the way, gone to its extremes? It's like everyone is included. Everyone must be included. Everyone is equal. Everyone gets a participation ribbon. There is no such thing as a winner and a loser. There is no such thing as better and worse. There is no such thing as judgment, which is to say, death of the ideal, of the meta-ideal, of hierarchy. It is to take the hierarchy and to flatten it and say everyone is equal. It is equality to the point of sacrificing the ideal. It is God is dead. The Nietzschean proclamation. Okay, let's backpedal a little bit. Could this inclusion to no end be an instantiation of toxic femininity? Now, to be clear, toxic femininity it's not restricted to females. It's not like females are bad and males are good. It's nothing like that. You want to think of these, the masculine spirit and the feminine spirit. We each have an element of the masculine and an element of the feminine in us. But it's almost like we as a collective are tipping dangerously toward the excesses of femininity that say everyone ought to be taken care of. We ought to be compassionate to everyone. And the way that we do that is we affirm any and all victimhood claims, and also any and all cultures. No matter what you believe, you are included. We are all equal. There is no such thing as a good or a bad idea or a good or a bad culture. Everyone is included. There is no better culture or worse culture. And we are willing to sacrifice the ideal to say, no, actually what we need is equality above all else. Multiculturalism. It's like the delusion of multiculturalism. Okay. Now, where is this infinite yes, this obsession, this ideology of inclusion and equality that then we find instantiated in this multiculturalism that is unable to discern and critique? Where is it coming from? Desperate for meaning, wannabe saviors who are susceptible to ideology and convenient blue pills that meet their needs, as opposed to what is true or what is reasonable. It's why when you begin to critique cultures, you are essentially saying there is an ideal. There is this meta-ideal to which we can strive. We ought to vet our worldviews for, is this true? Point A, is this fact or is this opinion? And what should be? Where are we aiming for? Does this actually help us move toward that meta-ideal? Yes or no? To do that, to critique like this, you are threatening the modern, I don't want to say atheists. You're threatening the modern ideologues' new religion of equality and their sense of meaning and purpose. And I did this, I drew this out in a previous video, but Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We don't live off just bread alone, our physiological needs. We have a need for belonging. And you can have a look into this yourself, but we are looking for a sense of belonging and a sense of meaning. And if we don't have a sophisticated framework that gives us that, and maybe that's what we used to have in religion, I'll let you make up your own mind on that. But if we don't have that, it's not, the man who does not believe in God does not simply believe in nothing. He'll be willing to believe in anything. This is what I mean by desperate for meaning, wannabe saviors who will swallow any oversimplified and yet inaccurate blue pill to meet their need for a sense of positive direction and self-esteem. We are in the midst of an identity crisis. We don't know who we are and what we stand for, which is to say, we do not know how to say no. You can only say no if you know what you stand for. If you know what you need to say yes to. What is point A? What is point B? What's the trajectory between the two? Unless you know that, unless you've meditated and crystallized and formalized your sense of what is, what ought to be, and how to get there, you do not know what to say no to. And it's like you're that person who says, everyone's my friend. If everyone's your friend, no one's your friend. Because you have no idea who you are and you have no boundaries with which to discern, is this actually someone whose personal culture, whose ideas, whose central ideas I agree with. Now, where is this potentially too much feminine energy, or this possession by the toxically excessive feminine spirit, and the absence of the balancing or harmonizing masculine? Where is this coming from? I mentioned it's in both men and women. It's not like a female specific issue. But could it be something to do with estrogenics? Could it be something to do with the testosterone levels of modern man dipping quite significantly? And where could that be coming from? Could it be coming from environmental factors? And then could that underlying biology be manifesting in the sociocultural level? Sociocultural? Could it be born of estrogenics in combination with women making their way into the workforce and positions of leadership and teaching, where it's now this feminine spirit that is beginning to have more and more control in these areas? And how might that bleed into, or what effects might that have amongst the culture? Say, for example, in leadership, if this feminine spirit of inclusion, equality, as opposed to the masculine spirit that says that is not good enough compared to the ideal, you are either in or you are out based on your performance. If the feminine spirit, the extreme feminine in the opposite direction, says anyone and everyone is included, could that manifest as the equality ideology in young people, and then now that's making its way into the culture more generally and instantiating in a multiculturalism that actually can't say no? And I want to distinguish between, like, multiculturalism is different. This is not the same. This is not the same as a multi-ethnic society. Anyone who believes in the sacred or divine element of human beings beyond arbitrary beyond arbitrary characteristics like skin color, eye color, height, stature, ethnicity, is going to believe in a multi-ethnic society. It doesn't matter what ethnicity you are to be on the team. Hold on, let me pull that. It doesn't matter what ethnicity you are to be on the team. That's actually to be racist, is to say, oh, because you're of this particular ethnicity, you can't be on the team, right? Whereas those who are pro-individualism, who are pro seeing the individual for the individual and their character as opposed to just their ethnicity, that is to be for a multi-ethnic society. And notice the difference there between that and multiculturalism. Multiculture, culture being set of ideas. There are some ideas that we cannot diverge on. In order to be husband and wife, in order to be in the same community, working toward the same goal, we need some shared sense or some degree, some elements of our worldviews, of our maps with respect to point A, point B, and how to get between them must be shared. They must be the same. There has to be a central element of unity around which we can then have a degree of liberalism and multiculturalism. But too much multiculturalism is bad. If you are not willing to say no to certain ideas, then you are possessed by the infinite yes or the toxic feminine. Could this also have something to do with fatherless homes? That's another idea that I won't go into now. Now, I'm going to wrap this up with an example. Okay. Who are we? These are the important questions. Who are we? What do we stand for? What are our central, non-negotiable values and beliefs? Unless we can answer this question, we are incapable of discernment, incapable of saying no, because we don't know what we want to include and exclude. We are stuck operating from the infinite yes, the new God. Equality to no end, inclusion to no end, that knows no boundaries nor standards. There is no idea nor set of ideas nor culture beyond the sick, zombie-like, unthinking, inclusive embrace of a culture and people who do not know who they are nor what they stand for anymore. Susceptible to possession by their shadows, susceptible to obsession with ideology. Convenient blue pills of untruth and unreason. Feelings over facts that meet our all too human need for a sense of meaning and purpose. Spiritual sustenance to offset the suffering and limitation that is baked into this game of being. So the question I want to leave you with, really, is what do you stand for? You are the culture, or you are responsible for the culture, and then we make up the culture. To have a culture is to have a set of standards. If you don't have a set of standards, that's no culture. It's almost like multiculturalism to no end is to say we don't have a culture. So what do you stand for? What do you believe is true? What do you believe ought to be? What is the ideal toward which we ought to orient ourselves? What is the ideal future that we ought to strive for? And then 3, how do we get there? How do we get there as a team? Point A, what do you believe? Point B, what is the goal? And then lastly, category 3 of ideas, what is moral? How exactly do we bridge the gap between point A and point B? This is what you need. You need to clarify your worldview, your map of what is, what ought to be, and how to bridge the gap. And then you need to be able to engage in dialogue. You need to be able to critique your map and have others critique your map. And then you need to critique their map. You need to share notes. You need to figure out, have you missed something here? Have you missed something here? Do you need to update your map? Have you missed something here? Do you need to update your map? And once you've done that, once you've refined your worldview or your map, you will have established your culture. This set of ideas that you believe and live out as good. And then, and only then, are you in a position to say yes to some ideas and cultures and no to other ideas and cultures. A thought experiment in the micro, and then you can scale this to the macro. You, then your team, say your family or social group or community, and then your country. Let's just take a couple of the key ideas that we might not even realize are central to our identity in the modern West. Individual liberty. Do you believe that people should be able to do what they want with their lives so long as it doesn't impinge upon another's individual liberty? If yes, that's a part of your culture. That is an idea that you believe, that makes up a part of your worldview. You believe in individual liberty, in autonomy. That's part of your ought. That's part of your point B. Now, if you believe that, then you need to be willing to say, hey, if someone wants to join your team, right, wants to join your social group or your community or your country and says, no, actually, we don't believe in individual liberty. We believe in whoever has the power can use other people for selfish ends. You can only say no to that idea or to that set of ideas or to that culture if you know what you are saying yes to, if you know what you believe. This all stems from an identity crisis. We don't know who we are. We've forgotten who we are. Are you pro-democracy? Democracy is born, right? It's born of that Judeo-Christian, unless someone wants to prove me wrong, the Judeo-Christian belief that each and every individual, regardless of their specifics, this guy might be strong, this guy might be smart, this lady might be gorgeous. Doesn't matter. Everyone is worthy of a sacred vote. It's not like this person gets 10 votes because they, they're more attractive or they're smarter. Do you believe in democracy? And if you do, that means you do not believe and you are not for its opposite. Say almost the opposite of individual liberty and democracy is authoritarianism. Now, if someone came to your team, right? If someone came to your team or your community and said, I believe in authoritarianism. I believe in I want to become the most powerful so I can then rule over everyone else. If they come to your team and you know you are for democracy and for individual liberty, then you know you can say no to that person. You say, the idea that you want to live out, I'm not for it. You are not included. Your culture, we're not multicultural about it. Okay, how about women's rights? You believe in women's rights? Are you a feminist? Are you pro women being able to live their lives as they see fit? Do you believe in women having equal rights under the law? Their testimonies in court being equally valid to that of a male? Do you believe that they ought to marry who they want and not simply who their fathers or brothers approve of, perhaps? And if so, again, you know what ideas and cultures you can say no to. And if someone wants to join our culture where we believe in women's rights, we believe in democracy, we believe in individual liberty, when they want to come and join the team, we say, no, we are not for your ideas. If you want to be a part of our culture, there are certain central elements of who we are as a team that you must adopt in order to integrate and assimilate. And if you don't, you're not part of the team. We need to be willing to say no. How about gay rights? Do you believe in two biological males wanting to have a romantic, intimate, sexual relationship together? If you do, then when someone comes along and says, my culture, that's not allowed, they're stoned to death, then again, you know to say to that person, hey, we are not for that, and you are not welcome on the team if that's what you believe. We are not so multicultural to no end that we're willing to let that person onto the team. And how about racism? Do you believe in Black or African American rights? Do you believe in Indigenous rights? Do you believe in Asian rights? Do you believe in Jewish rights? And if so, when someone comes along and says, gas the Jews, when someone comes along and says they believe that blacks are somehow, that black people or African Americans are an inferior race, if they were to come to your team and say such things, you say, we're not for it. You are not welcome. Your culture is incompatible with who we are. It's a no from me. You're capable of saying no to bad ideas. Right? And I thought I'd insert a couple of bad examples, right? Which is what I've just done. If someone says gas the Jews, if that's part of your culture, if that's the set of ideas that you and your people are living out, you are not welcome here. If you were to say gas the blacks, same applies. You are not welcome here. We believe in individualism. We believe in a multi-ethnic society. We believe in judging someone based on the content of their character, not the color of their skin or their ethnicity. If someone were to say, women ought not have access to education, they ought to stay in the kitchens, and they ought to cover themselves from head to toe in clothing and never reveal parts of their skin in public, say, and they ought to do everything that their husbands say, like their servants. Do you think that's a bad idea? And if it is, right, you have to be willing to say no. So if that's what you and your culture live out, you're not welcome here. If we are obsessed and possessed with multiculturalism to no end, with equality, we cannot judge, we cannot say that any idea is better or worse than another, then we don't know how to say no to these things. And you can do the same thing here. If there's a culture, a group of people with a set of ideas who come to you and your team and they say, we believe that gay people ought to be stoned to death, you better be willing to say, if that's what you believe, you are not welcome on this team. Would you let them onto your team? Are such ideas worthy of inclusion. And notice that the pathological inclusion to no end, the infinite yes, incapable of saying no, incapable of establishing an ideal, incapable of being a judge, a discerning judge. We'll let these ideas in the name of equality. All to meet their desperation for a sense of meaning and purpose. It's an ideology. Are such cultures worthy of inclusion? These ones, right? If anyone lives out a set of these ideas, we must know who we are and what we stand for in order to say no. Know what you want so you can say no to what you don't. Now I'm going to wrap this video up with, when it comes to finding common ground on multiculturalism, like I said at the very beginning, a lot of people use and associate with this notion of multiculturalism a sense of liberalism and freedom of choice. You might have a particular set of rituals and traditions that you live out with your little community and a set of traditions that I live out with mine. But let me come across here. My set of traditions, your set of traditions amongst your community. But whilst we may differ on the more superficial, the deeper value for liberalism and that Judeo-Christian belief that each and every individual has a spark of the divine in them, a belief in human rights beyond one's ethnicity or sex, we have that to unify us. There is this underlying value for liberalism, freedom, and choice, which I think is it's this central element of the West and our identity as the West that we need to re-find and re-anchor at the center of our culture, such that we can actually discern who we want as part of our team and who we are willing to say a hard and fast no to. Beyond race and ethnicity, we believe in human rights beyond skin color, beyond sex, beyond religion and other tribal affiliation, so long as we have this central conception that each individual is made in the image of God, so to speak, or that we have this spark of divinity, the divine and sovereign individual. Now, in the wake of God is dead, of the loss of faith, we leave ourselves susceptible to an unhinged, disembodied, prideful intellect that has fallen in love with itself, that is desperate for this sense of meaning and direction, susceptible to ideology, inaccurate, oversimplified, crippled religious or religions, crippled, inaccurate worldviews that give us the sense of meaning, purpose, and direction that we are desperate for in the face of life's suffering and limitation. And so we swallow this blue pill of equality above all, and we can soar off the branch on which we sit, aka, I would say that the tree or the branch from which or on which Western liberal democracies sit, the branch on which the West sits is liberal democracies. It's not even liberal democracies yet. This is like individualism. liberalism. The belief that each and every person should be able to live his or her life as he or she sees fit, because there is a divine spark in each and every individual. It's the notion of human rights. And the West, the faithless West, the West that has lost touch with its roots, with no sense of identity and who it is and where we have come from, soars off this branch, all the while yelling at the top of its lungs, equality, inclusion, and multiculturalism. The infinite, yes. Possessed by the infinite, yes. So, with all of that said, I hope this has helped open your eyes to perhaps a red pill that you always knew on some level, but you didn't yet know how deep the rabbit hole goes, or how deep you needed to go down the rabbit hole in order to really flesh out these ideas and explain and articulate why multiculturalism to no end, inclusion to no end, why equality to no end is, it's not an idea that we want to live out. Why multiculturalism can be too much, why you can have too much multiculturalism, too much diversity, too much inclusion. Hopefully this has helped you articulate or give words to this red pill, so that, one, you yourself are not susceptible to swallowing the blue pill, but also, two, when you find someone who is a blue pill dealer, it was actually a lyric that I wrote in a track once. When you find a blue pill dealer, you have the words, the articulation to hopefully share with them why they might be flawed in their ways, and from a safe and loving place, show them how multiculturalism to no end can actually be counterproductive. And I think the easiest way to get there, guys, is to ask some of those questions that I was asking at the end there. Someone who says, gas the Jews, someone who says, kill all African Americans, someone who says, stone the gays, someone who says women should be locked up at home. Can we find common ground that we are not for those ideas? And if yes, some ideas are worse than others. And then, if we can agree that cultures are just sets of ideas collectively held, then we can critique cultures and we can say some cultures are better or worse than others. And you can be more specific. Some cultures are better or worse than others in certain areas, but then you can also zoom out and judge on a more general scale. And if you know that, if you can start to find common ground on what it is you are for and what it is you are against, then we can start to establish a shared identity with respect to point A, point B, and how to be to bridge the gap. With all of that said, I hope that you found this video helpful in unpacking these ideas. Let me know what you thought in the comments, and I hope you have a great day.